The 1960s are often considered the golden age of music. And with the rosy-tinted glasses of 5 decades separating us from then, it's easy to assume that all music was great and everyone loved it and was happy all the time. But that simply isn't true. Plenty of people detested certain bands from the swinging 60s. Some of them quite popular and surprising too. I'm Nostalgic Nick with Do You Remember? And today we're looking at some of the most hated bands from the 1960s. Some of them we still loathe today. Some have turned into absolute icons. But all these popular bands garnered some hate back in their day. Hey, if you don't mind, hit that thumbs up icon. And make sure you're subscribed to our channel for more. But without further ado, let's suckle at the sweet teat of loathing. The Osmonds. Sure, it seems like low-hanging fruit, but we have to start the list with the Osmonds, a band that has been among America's most hated in several different eras. The group rose to fame in the mid-60s as a barbershop quartet, performing on variety shows like The Jerry Lewis Show. Yes, you heard that right, a barbershop quartet in the 60s, not the 40s. And while Hendrix was gracing the world stages, not too cool. But along the way, the band absorbed several other siblings, and decided that instead of music for the geriatric crowd, they were going to become pop stars, and promptly in 1967 released a song called Flower Music.
Flower music, flower music,
Too on the nose? Yeah. Which proves you can take the band out of the cheese, but not the cheese out of the band. The Osmonds continued evolving over the years, but never really in a good way. And in our view, achieved the notable distinction of being one of the campiest, most hated bands in 2 decades. The Beatles.
They are the Eggmen. I am the Walrus.
Okay, I know what you're thinking. Really, the Beatles? The band that inspired a literal mania back in the 60s, with fans screaming so loud you couldn't hear the music the band was playing. Yep, them. Because as popular as the Fab Four were, there were certain groups that hated them with a fervor so passionate that it was kind of dangerous. In 1966, the band declined an invitation to have breakfast with the First Lady of the Philippines, Imelda Marcos, setting off nationwide riots and forcing the band to flee the country one step ahead of a lynch mob. Then John Lennon remarked to a reporter, saying the Beatles were more popular than Jesus now. A comment that, did not go over well in some parts of the world, leading to their music being banned in Spain and South Africa. The Vatican issued a protest, and Beatles records were burned all over the American South. The Monkees.
Take the last train to Clarksville, now I must hang up the phone.
Speaking of the Beatles, now let's talk about the Monkees. How does a band that has sold over 75 million records and produced some amazing hits like I'm a Believer and Last Train to Clarksville make this list? Welp, because at first they were not a real band. They were the creation of TV executives hoping to cash in on Beatlemania by producing a sitcom starring an imaginary band who wanted to be the Beatles. And boy did it work. The then made-up Monkees became incredibly popular, even though they had minimal input into their own music. But instead, a whole stable of studio musicians and songwriters wrote all their hits. The Monkees naturally received a lot of guff for being fake and untalented, ultimately a phony cash grab. So much so that after their second album, they wrestled control of their musical process away from the studio, and promptly started releasing subpar music, breaking up shortly thereafter. I guess they should have been less of a believer in themselves. The Doors. One of the most iconic American bands of all time, and they make this list on behalf of the thousands of people who were subjected to one of their live shows in the late 60s. Picture this: you're about to see your favorite band live for the first time, but soon eager anticipation gives way to first annoyance, then anger, and then hatred in quick succession as the band's lead singer shows up an hour late, falls down drunk, passes out multiple times during the show, is quite antagonistic antagonistic while conscious, and eventually gets hauled off by the cops before the show ends, which basically describes the Doors in concert in the late 60s. And all this culminated in Jim Morrison being arrested after a show in Miami, after allegedly exposing his penis to the crowd. The Association. Some of the bands on this list were hated because of their antics outside of music, some because they weren't supposedly real bands at all. But this next act makes the list solely based on their own musical merit. In a decade that delved the true depths of love and human emotion with songs like Something and God Only Knows, The Association were busy releasing the song Cherish, possibly the most terrible piece of saccharine crap ever written. For example,
You don't know how many times I wish that I could mold you into someone who could cherish me.
I'll give you a second to let the dry heave subside. And honestly, the rest of the Association's catalog is just as schmaltzy, and I'm pretty sure the whole horrible genre of the 1970s easy listening music can be traced back to them. Seriously, hatred deserved. Bob Dylan.
Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me.
The fact that Dylan makes the list is simply due to the self-righteous, pretentious nature hiding deep down inside some of music's most ardent fans. By 1964, Dylan was a legend, a folk music god, and civil rights icon. So what could he do to piss off his most loyal fans? Why, by daring to evolve musically and pick up an electric guitar, of course. In 1965, Dylan released his masterpiece Highway 61 Revisited, a record made fully plugged in with a backup band that marked his full departure from his folk roots. And how did many of his former fans react? Why, instead of rejoicing in some of the most important music ever made, they reviled Dylan as a sellout, vowing to never buy his record or see him in concert, which culminated in Dylan audibly being called Judas by a member of the audience at a concert in Manchester, before silencing his critics with a thunderous rendition of Like a Rolling Stone. The Velvet Underground.
Whiplash girl child in the dark.
When the Velvet Underground burst onto the scene in the mid-60s, popular music just wasn't ready for their experimental recording techniques, extensive use of reverb, and mature themes of drug use and sex. I mean, do you think the Beach Boys would ever write a song called Venus in Furs, based on a sadomasochistic 19th century German novel? No, I didn't think so. In fact, they were so unpopular, their 1966 seminal, groundbreaking debut album, The Velvet Underground and Nico, an album that Rolling Stone has since called the 23rd greatest record ever made. Well, that sucker only sold 30,000 copies in its first 5 years, meaning that almost every citizen of the great metropolis of Rome, Georgia could own the record no problem. Despite the public's feeling about the Velvet Underground in their own time, the band's legacy couldn't be more positive. As legendary musician Brian Eno put it, quote, "Everyone who bought one of those 30,000 copies started a band." Tiny Tim. Sometimes a musical artist is hated for their personal life. You know, Jerry Lee Lewis marrying his cousin. Sometimes they're hated for their whole body of work, like everything Nickelback has ever and will ever do. And then sometimes they are hated for one single thing. One song so heinous the world can never forgive them. Enter Tiny Tim.
I do what I like, just what I like, and how I love it.
A folk singer in New York in the late 60s, who knew more about old music than anyone, according to none other than Bob Dylan. Unfortunately for humanity, however, the song that Tim chose to grace the world with and made him famous was Tiptoe Through the Tulips, accompanied by a ukulele and sung in an agonizing falsetto.
Tiptoe through the tulips with me.
The song, except for a few die-hard fans who must have had too much Kool-Aid, was rightly considered to be perhaps the most annoying song ever recorded. It's so bad that based solely on Tiptoe Through the Tulips, poor Tiny Tim will forever be enshrined on this list. But the guy is oh so interesting, so head over to our Tiny Tim deep dive to learn more about his high voice and unhigh life. There's a lot of hate out there. and some of it for little reason. And now we want to hear from you. Do you think these bands deserve the hate they got? Were you burning any of the records? Or were you blaring their tracks loud? And are there any other bands from the 1960s that you despised? Add them to the comments and let's start a debate. As always, please hit that thumbs up icon and subscribe to the channel for more. But from all of us here at Do You Remember, we want to thank you for watching.